Hello, and welcome to today's story. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more. The story you're about to hear is based on accounts and rumors. Its full truth can't be confirmed. Now sit back, relax, and let's dive right in. I arrived before sunrise because the email said the principal liked punctuality. I parked in the far corner of the lot under a sycamore whose limbs looked like veins against a low, heavy sky, and I sat there with my palms on the steering wheel until the dashboard clock clicked from 6:59 to 7:00. My breath fogged a patch on the windshield and cleared. The school loomed across the cracked asphalt, a low brick box with a cafeteria annex and two wings slanting out like blunt arms. Half the letters were missing from the marquee out front. Welcome B.C. Subs. I walked in with a tote bag over my shoulder and a thermos of tea, and the first smell that met me was industrial cleaner, sharp, minty cold at the back of my throat, undercut by something warmer and older. Dust, paper, stale chalk. The office was just to the right of the main doors, behind glass that had been etched with a cougar mascot and Maine. A sign promised visitors report here, with a faded arrow pointing down to a scratched bell. The secretary stood when I stepped in, her smile practiced and broad. Her name tag said Diane in all caps, and a small crocheted pumpkin sat by her keyboard, though it wasn't October yet. "Mr.," she said, hand halfway extended. The clock behind her said 7:02. I opened my mouth. It was strange, the way the name took a second to lift. "Carver," I said. "Theo Carver. Subbing for Henderson, English?" "Of course," she said, as if I'd confirmed something she was already sure of. "We're so grateful you could come on such short notice." She slid a clip-on badge across the counter, a laminated rectangle with my name printed in blue, and a number in red, 14. "You'll need to wear that where it can be seen. Lights in the east wing flicker sometimes," she added conversationally. "Don't mind them. Frank's working on it." "Frank?" "Our custodian." She leaned over the counter to peer at me, squinting as if a thought caught her somewhere behind the eyes. "You look very familiar." I laughed. Maybe I have one of those faces. "You do," she said without humor. "You really do." She gave me a manila envelope, thick with handouts and schedules. "Bell schedule's in there, your attendance sheets, a map. Mr. Henderson's lesson plans are, well, he keeps things tidy." Her mouth tugged. "Room 205, second floor, east wing. Watch the third step up. The tread's loose." A man passed behind her, brisk with a lanyard, heavy with keys. He paused at the door to the hallway and pointed at my sticker and gave me a thumbs up. "You're early this time," he said, and disappeared without looking for my response. Diane didn't seem to hear him. She'd already turned to her computer. "Have a good day, Mr. Carver," she said, and when she thought I'd gone, I heard her mutter, "Again." On the way up, the lights did flicker. The East Wing's ceiling panels were yellowed around the edges. Some buzzed, some were dead. Every few steps, the smell shifted. Bleach near the science labs, coffee near what was probably the teacher workroom, something like wet wool near a locked door marked storage. The tread on the third step up did indeed wobble. I paused to see if it was actually loose. It wasn't, it just gave the feeling of empty space beneath. Room 205 was on the right, door propped open by a wedge of extra textbooks. Henderson's name was on the placard outside, but his first name had been rubbed off or never printed. The room was what you'd expect. Square, windows looking out to a courtyard with a brick planter and an iron bench, a smart board with an old projector mounted above it, a whiteboard, dark with ghost streaks of old marker. Posters of Shakespeare and Langston Hughes curled at the edges. I put my bag on the desk. On Henderson's chair, an elastic hair tie stuck to the vinyl like a fossil of previous afternoons. I set out the handouts, checked his lesson plan, a short story by Carver, which felt like a coincidence too obvious to mention if anyone noticed, and turned on the computer. The login screen had his name. The clock at the bottom right corner said 7:15. The wall clock said 7:11. The second hand on the wall clock ticked and then stopped for a breath, then ticked again, as if deciding. First bell at 7:30. I copied the attendance list onto a clipboard. My name was printed at the top. Substitute, Theodore Carver. The handwriting on the attendance sheet had been filled in, though nothing to do with me. Next to each printed student name was a set of pale check marks, like someone had already taken attendance for me with a too light pen. At the bottom, someone had written my full name and the date in a hand I didn't recognize. Careful cursive, loops like old photographs. Theodore Abel Carver. I paused. The middle name was correct, though I never used it. The hallway murmured to life as feet and voices came up from the main hall, crowding and then thinning. My first students trickled in, some glancing at me and away, some stopping at the threshold like they'd expected someone else, all of them carrying that particular morning energy of rural kids who haven't decided if school will be a relief from their lives or the opposite. One girl, Gina, walked straight to the window and stood with her palm flat on the glass like she was expecting it to warm beneath her hand. "Good morning," I said. "I'm Mr. Carver. We'll be working on it." They were polite enough, yes, but off in small ways. A boy in a camo hoodie sat in the front and watched me with an unblinking attention that felt more like diagnosis than curiosity. Another boy with acne made of blessed little constellations opened his notebook and chewed the paper at the corner. A girl with a tiny gold Jesus on a chain avoided my eyes so deliberately it created its own kind of attention. When I passed out the handouts, most of them took them with both hands like objects with heat. Somewhere down the hall, a laugh cut off. The bell rang, though I didn't see anyone touch the panel. The wall clock said 7:25 and then snapped its black hands forward to 7:30 like a magic trick performed against its will. I took roll, checking names and glancing to faces. When I called Gina, the girl at the window didn't turn. The one in the back lifted her chin and said distinctly, "Here, today." The camo boy smirked and lowered his eyes to his desk as if at a private joke when I said Jackson L. Two boys said "here" in overlapping voices and then both laughed, surprised to discover each other's timing. A boy named Eli looked around when I called him, like he hadn't recalled beforehand he was an Eli. "Are you really Mr. Carver?" someone asked when I paused, not unkindly. Because the last substitute wasn't. "Who was the last substitute?" I asked. Silence. It was not hostile. It was the blank wall of kids who simply don't have information and refuse to fake it. "We're reading Raymond Carver's Cathedral today," I said. "Raise your hand if you've read it before." Some hands, some non-hands that had the shape of hands, not raised. The air conditioner coughed and stirred. Something ticked in the vent above the whiteboard. Bug, and stopped. We read. They were engaged by the story in a way that made me briefly forget the earlier oddness. They liked the narrator's brisk ugliness. They liked the slow, strange opening of the narrator's mind. At the part where the drawing begins, the boy with acne whispered "oh" in a way that made me like him. I asked the kind of questions student teachers ask when they want students to feel clever rather than cornered. It went fine. It went. And when the bell rang for the end of first period, a girl with chipped purple nail polish slipped a folded sheet of paper onto my desk as the flow of bodies became a river in the door. I noticed it because the folded corner had a fray, like a hangnail. I waited until the room was empty to unfold it. "You're not supposed to be here." The letters were blocky, nearly childish, drawn slow, ironed by pressure. "The real you gets here tomorrow." I looked up at the clock. It said 8:18, and then shuddered to 8:20 and settled. The hallway was suddenly and deeply quiet, like someone had shut a door between me and the rest of the building. At the top of the attendance sheet, a smudge I didn't remember touching had spread into a fingerprint, swirled familiar. The note sat on the desk like a weight I could feel in my forearms. Second period arrived with a sudden slam of sound, a rush of bodies, laughter that didn't quite match the mouths that made it. I kept the note face down and slid a notebook on top of it. I told myself that it was a prank, an initiation, a country kid joke. I made my tone light. I held up the handout again like a shield. "Didn't you already do this last week?" a boy asked it idly, not accusing, as he let himself drop into a desk with a clatter. A couple of others nodded and murmured something that might have been agreement. "We did the drawing thing, like we closed our eyes." "You must have had a different sub," I said. And even as I said it, something in the way the fluorescent above me hummed, steady, then stuttering, then steady, made me feel like I was speaking into a recording and hearing myself a half-second later. "It was you," the boy said, and then seemed to reconsider. "It was like you." The second period attendance list had check marks, too, fainter than the first. At the bottom, in careful cursive, Carver, Theodore Abel, present. My hand drifted to my badge and found that the plastic had warmed against my chest, as if something behind it breathed. The classes continued. Lunchtime arrived with a thud of trays and voices that rose and sank like waves. The staff room lay at the end of the hall, past a bulletin board made of cork that had been stabbed so many times the cork had a rash. The sign on the staff room door said, "Members only. Tea teachers eat." Someone had scratched beneath in pen. Inside, a fridge taped shut with a note that said, "Please stop stealing." A microwave with a yellowed plastic handle. A coffee machine that had seen wars. 2 round tables. 4 chairs, then 3, then 4 again when I wasn't watching. A woman with hair the color of pennies sat at one table with her lunch in containers, neat as an accountant. A man in a zip-up fleece came and stood by the coffee, poured it, took a sip, and grimaced. "Mud," he said. He swirled the mug so that the liquid lapped at the rim and stayed just shy of leaping over. "You're the sub," he told me, and when I nodded, he blinked as if satisfied and said, "Didn't you? Never mind." And then, "Frank'll like you. He likes reliable faces." "Frank," I said. I hadn't met him yet. I wondered, as I said the name, why it felt rehearsed. "The custodian," he said, turning his mug so the chip faced away from him. He stared into the coffee like it could answer something. "You must have met him. He says you're early this time." The woman with the copper hair rose and put her hand on my shoulder as she passed to the sink. It was a brief, warm pressure. "First day is always odd," she said. "Everything is new, but everything somehow thinks it knows you. It's just a building. It's just the paint. You'll be fine." Her voice was kind, honest, in a way that made me want to believe her. "I did your cover last Thursday," she said, as if to soften the strangeness with an explanation. "I'm Janine. Good luck, Mr. Carter." "Carver," I corrected, and it came out automatic without a bite. "Sure," she said. She didn't look back as she left, and she took the smell of apples with her. On the way back to my room, I caught sight of him. Across the courtyard, in the second-floor windows of the opposite wing, a man watching. He had his hands on the sill, the way everyone rests their hands when they are trying not to let them fall. He wore what I wore, jacket dark enough it read as black, light shirt, tie a clean blue. He had my posture, that slightly apologetic lean, like gravity always had a small advantage. He had my face. My first thought was, the glass is showing me. My second thought was, the angle is wrong, this is not a mirror. My third thought looked for the rational scaffolding on which to hang this and found none. Between my heartbeats, I felt the sound of the building. Vents, students, the rumble of an old boiler, drop a half step, like a song played slower. He lifted his hand. He didn't wave. He placed his palm flat on the glass and pressed it the way the girl had, and I could see the reflection of the courtyard in his eyes. The iron bench in the courtyard had only 2 legs, the other 2 missing, and yet, in the reflection, it had 4. "Mr. Carver," someone called from behind me, and when I turned a boy I didn't recognize yet, tall, hair that couldn't decide which way to lie, passed in the hall with his friends and then slowed. "You okay?" he asked, already drifting. I looked back to the window in the opposite wing. The figure was gone. The window glass was black in patches where it had failed and milky where it had fogged. The space where he'd been was now a reflection of me, and then of the hallway light behind me, and then of nothing. I taught classes, I graded things that didn't need to be graded. My pen bled a little on my fingers so that when I pushed my hair back, I left a faint blue streak above my temple. I didn't look in the window again until my students were bent over independent work, and the room had gone soft with the sound of paper. When I did, the courtyard was empty. The iron bench was whole, then not, depending on whether I looked at it directly or from the corner of my eye. The planter sat around a tree that had no leaves, even though out back I'd noticed cottonwoods that hadn't yet given up. The ironwork on the railing of the opposite wing had a twist like rope. It was around then that I realized the attendance sheet's paper had a different feel than the handouts. It was heavier, thicker, like a wedding invitation. If I rubbed it against itself, it buzzed like a cicada in my fingers. Between 4th and 5th periods, I peeked into the workroom to make copies of the exit tickets Henderson had suggested. The copier stood with its gray mouth open, the tray empty. When I turned it on, it hummed and blinked, and then began to spit paper with methodical competence. It printed not my handout, but my resume. Every line exactly as I had formatted it in the fall, down to the small typo in references available upon request. I had noticed too late. It had my phone number, my old address. The copy count climbed. 1, 2, 3. My name repeated, black, crisp. "Hey," said a counselor type in a cardigan at the door, leaning in, her smile worn out, sweet. "We were expecting someone else." She blinked rapidly. "No offense." "None taken," I said. I fumbled with the buttons. The machine continued to birth me. My name slid in rafts to the output tray. My name slithered out onto the floor when the tray filled. The machine didn't stop until I opened it and pulled out the toner cartridge like a heart. As I knelt to gather the copies, the hallway beyond the workroom filled with whispering that wasn't quite words. It was the shape of words in air. I could tell from the rhythm where the syllables would land. If I tried to understand the content, it slid off. My ears made a little ache at the hinge. When I stepped into the hall, the whisper stopped. The silence shone as bright as a polished instrument. A piece of paper lay at the workroom threshold, perhaps dropped, perhaps placed. It had a rust pucker at one corner, like someone had held it with a paper clip long enough for the metal to bleed. I didn't pick it up. I watched the way the overhead light peaked on the tiny bump, dulled, brightened. In my 5th period class, the boy in the camo hoodie, his name, finally anchored, was Tate, waited until the rest had settled and said, "You're wearing a different tie today." "I wasn't here yesterday," I said. He smiled, and it was not a scornful smile. It was the smile of someone who knew a trick to a coin that I did not. "Sure." We read quietly for a while. Outside, the clouds sank lower and the windows glowed with that particular white that makes the inside of buildings feel deeper and further. The air felt thicker, as if the vents had begun to exhale slowly instead of hold their breath. When I called on a girl named Maria, she spoke in a voice that had a second voice laid over it, exactly like hers, but a half step off. As if we were all coming through a delay. It was the first time I heard my own voice echo. When no one else was speaking, I said, "Good point." And my voice said it a half second later with a little rise that I hadn't used. At the end of the period, I wrote the quote of the day on the board, "Only connect." I capped the marker and looked back and found that the quote had written itself beneath mine. Same letters, slightly smaller. "Only connect, only connect, only connect." They layered until the green brick behind the whiteboard felt as if it had taken the chalk into itself. In the staff room, by the single window that looked out at the parking lot, a stack of old yearbooks slumped on a shelf. On a whim, I took one. The cover was a cougar robed in stylized flames. The year was a few years back. In the staff section, a man with my face looked out from a row of small frames. My hair was a little shorter, the tie darker, the look in the eyes expectant. The name beneath was misprinted in a way that would be easy to ignore if you hadn't been looking for it. Thodor Carver. The next yearbook had the name right. The next had no staff photos at all. The record had left a blank where faces should be, a decision that must have had a reason that no one had thought to write down. The last one had a picture of Henderson smiling with squinched eyes and a cat on his desk. The cat's face was blurred, as if it had moved when the shutter closed. "Old things make their own choices," someone said, and I turned. A man stood in the doorway, tall, sunburnt at the edges beneath the collar, keys heavy at his hip. He wore a shirt with his name stitched on it, Frank. "Do they?" I said. He smiled and lifted his chin. Sometimes they like to do what they did. Habit's the strongest muscle. "You're Mr. Carver." "Yes." "You're early," he said. "For what?" He looked past me, as if the answer were written in the parking lot on the hoods of cars. "Someone will spill milk in the cafeteria at lunch," he said. "A boy will take a fall on the bleachers after last bell. The lights in your room will dim and then come back bright enough to hurt your eyes, and you'll look at the clock." He said it as if reading a list. We don't always choose our turn. "Can you tell me why the copier printed my resume?" I asked, surprising myself with the way the question came out like a stone I'd been holding in my mouth. He nodded as if that were familiar. "Because it remembers you," he said, and I thought how I had never assigned memory to a machine as an actor. "Because it could. Things get laid down. Sometimes they get replayed." He left without waiting for my thanks, and I stood there with the yearbook open, looking at a small picture of my own face, and behind it feeling something shift in the building, as if a weight on the opposite side of a seesaw had been removed, and the whole structure were rising a little on one end. By seventh period, the light had the color of late afternoon, despite the wall clock insisting on what it insisted. The hallway had emptied and filled in loops that didn't align with the schedule. Sometimes the bell would ring and nothing would happen. Sometimes it wouldn't, and kids would flow anyway. I stood in my doorway and watched two boys circle back past 3 times in under a minute, the third time with their hair parted on the other side. The loose tread on the stairs seemed to give a little more. The smell of cleaning chemicals intensified, then faded to the ghost of something floral, then returned as a mint we were all chewing invisibly. A teacher I hadn't met, with a vest patterned in ducks, stopped at my door. "You doing okay?" he asked. "Is this—" I began, and I realized how the question would sound. "Is this how it is?" He adjusted his vest, considered. "You get used to the building's moods. It's like old barns or churches. It keeps company with itself." He looked over my shoulder at my students who bent over their desks, like images in an ad. "We all follow the list well enough. The list follows us." "What list?" The one in the drawer. He nodded at my desk. Henderson keeps it under the cassettes. What cassettes? I said, but he was gone, already halfway to the stairwell. In Henderson's bottom drawer, under a detritus of pens and rubber bands and a half-eaten roll of antacids, a black plastic cassette case lay like a fossil. I lifted it. It had no label. Beneath it, a legal pad on which the top sheet had been torn away. Under the second sheet, faintly impressed by pressure, a list. If I tilted it, the letters glimmered. 8:34. Girl asked to go to nurse, doesn't go. 9:12. Announcement. Glitch. Repeats. We are. 10:27. Copy machine. Resume. 11:02. Courtyard. Self. 12:14. Frank says, you're early. 1:03. Storage room door. 1:39. Note. Too early. 2:20. Arrival. My eye snagged on storage room door. The storage room door at the end of the east wing had been locked that morning, the smell of wet wool feathering beneath it. I had not tried it at 1:03. The bell for the beginning of seventh period murmured, then brayed, and a voice came over the intercom with a sound like breath near the mic. We are, it said, then cut, then pipped back. We are experiencing minor technical difficulties. Please disregard. The voice sounded like Diane's, but a Diane a few degrees warmer or cooler. I looked up at the clock. 1:02. The second hand stuttered and leaned forward like someone pushing open a heavy door. 1 minute and 3 seconds. I told my students to continue reading. I walked down the hallway to the storage room door as if it had been my idea. The door was painted the gray beige of file folders. Someone had stuck a paper snowflake to it whose arms had softened with humidity. The handle was cold when I reached for it. It turned in my hand. Inside, the light came on a second after the switch, as if it, too, had needed to think. Metal shelves, delightfully practical, spare paper towels, a box of emergency deodorant, cardboard labeled chemistry goggles, a bucket of tennis balls. The smell was stronger, yes, wool and wet carpet and the sharpness of unslept nights. The room had no windows. A single dark spot stained the cement near the back wall, in the corner where things were jammed. Something rustled behind the top shelf and then stilled. On the back of the door, at eye level, someone had scrawled with a black marker, broad point that bled into the paint. You are early, that was all. A cough, a small sound not human, came from where a dozen old TVs crouched like black cows. I took a step forward and immediately wanted to take it back. I didn't. My shoes made their own decisions between the TVs, a plastic bin, the lid askew. A stack of clipboards leaned like a pile of shields. A loose few sheets of paper had slid beneath the bin so that only their corners showed like tongues. I knelt and picked one up. Too early, it said. The letters were blocky, drawn slow, ironed by pressure. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't remember setting it to vibrate. I pulled it out. The screen lit up. A text from unknown, arriving. A second text, parking lot. I looked at the time on the phone, 1:38. I looked up at the room clock above the storage shelf, 1:39. Someone had written 1:39 on the legal pad list in my imagination and in real ink. On my way back to my classroom, the hallway seemed longer. I mean that in the simple way. The distance had stretched. The scene repeated every 20 feet. The water fountain with the loose button, the poster about bullying that said, "Speak up," with cartoon mouths and speech bubbles, the locked door with the small wired glass. I passed the window to the courtyard and paused and measured the courtyard with my eyes like one measures a stage before a performance. The iron bench had become simply a shadow that suggested the idea of a bench. The tree had leaves now, small, bright, like something new in a familiar room. Across the way, in the glass of the opposite wing, I glimpsed movement, the shape of a person turning away as if not to be seen. Their shirt was light, a tie, a hand. "Mr. Carver?" A voice called from far behind me, and when I turned, the hall had no one in it. The fluorescent above me buzzed and then went so quiet I could hear my own breath. When I reached my classroom door, a student stood in it. She had hair that fell in a sheet so black it drank the light. "Can I go to the nurse?" she asked. "If you need to," I said. Her eyes flicked to the clock on the back wall and then back to me. She nodded as if confirming an answer she already knew. She didn't go to the nurse. I watched her walk to the stairwell and through, and on the other side of the window in the stairwell door, she passed again, hair on a different shoulder. The day complicated itself. In the last two periods, the walls had a gray light to them that came from nowhere. The students were quieter and therefore louder. A boy stared at me with a concern that made him look like a small adult. "You're doing fine," he said, apropos of nothing. "I know," I said, too quickly. "We'll listen," he said. "We remember. Mostly we remember. In the very last period, something like ninth, though their schedule called it something else, they were past polite. The air felt thick in a way that collected in the ear canal so that the room had a little underwater dullness, and every sound above that thickness sounded brittle. The announcements blared and then didn't. Through it all, the intercom stayed a little warm, like someone still held the button down at the main office. "Didn't you already do this last week?" a boy in the back asked again, but it was not mocking. It was an inquiry into physics, a question for a lab. We drew with our eyes closed. You told us to trust it. "You remember that?" I asked. He nodded. For a second, he looked too old for his chair. "We remember a lot. It's just not in a line." The final bell was supposed to ring at 2:10. At 2:05, at least 3 clocks in my room tried to be true. The wall clock stepped forward and stepped back. The computer clock blinked to 2:04, and then died and then lit again. The little analog on my desk that I didn't remember placing there vibrated like an insect wanting out of glass. I felt the tremor in my knuckles and my teeth. The intercom clicked and my voice came over it, speaking the words I was thinking. "Please have your students remain seated until the dismissal announcement," I said to the school, and in my room, and the students looked up, surprised to hear it from me and not me. They put their pencils down. We all looked at the door. The door opened. Diane stood there a second, her face white in the square of wired glass. Then she moved aside. A man stood in the doorway. He wore my clothes, but slightly different choices. A tie with stripes, not solid. A shirt with a faint pattern like the ghost of plaid. He had my movement, my uncertain tilt. He had the pen ink stain above his temple, faint like mine had been. He had my face, tender around the mouth from sleeping wrong on the pillow. He had my name tag, Theodore Carver, 14. The red numbers looked darker. He had my voice when he said good afternoon, but he said it with a rhythm that felt like I remembered from a different day. Time did not fragment with shattering glass. It behaved like heavy fabric. It draped. "Which one of you has my key?" he asked, in a voice that was calm enough to set a table. I looked at his hands. He held a manila envelope like mine. He held it like something he hadn't decided whether to open. "Frank let me in," he said when I didn't move. He said I was late. "I'm Theo Carver," I said. He nodded as if collecting data. "So am I." We looked at each other. Our students looked at us both and then at the clock. The boy in the camo hoodie had his head cocked as if listening for a distant engine. The girl with the gold Jesus held the chain at her throat and twisted it around her finger until her fingertip darkened. "Gentlemen," she said quietly, and her two voices braided. "Do we need both?" The other me stepped in. He moved with care, and the way you move when you don't want to spill something intangible. He kept a certain distance between us, as if we had memorized this radius. The students drew their breaths like people around a bed. We were polite. "It's my first day here," he said. "I got the email yesterday. Henderson is out with shingles. I brought his sub-plans," and he held up the envelope. "I parked by the sycamore because I thought, Diane said my badge number is 14. "It is," I said. "I've taught this lesson before." He set the envelope on the desk. He looked down, as if reading the list beneath the legal pad that I knew sat there. "We draw. We don't look. We close our eyes. You tell them to trust the line." "Students," I said, my voice catching once on a word, "you can pack your things?" They packed. They did it slow enough to listen. We didn't talk while they crammed papers into backpacks like memories into drawers. The boy in the back, who had asked about last week, shouldered his bag and said to the room, not to us, "The bell's going to ring wrong." He didn't sound upset. He sounded relieved to have reached a part of the list that didn't require improvisation. "Can I began, and I realized I had wanted to ask him, myself, something ordinary. A teacher question. How do you get them to respond to the Carver story? Do you show the blind man before? Do you admit you don't like the narrator? I wanted to ask what it was like to teach where you are not sure if your body is the same on every bell. "Do you get a headache right here?" he asked instead, and he touched his temple exactly where I had left the blue smudge. I touched it too, as if to prove I existed in the conversation, and my finger came away clean. The ink had come off somewhere between periods. The dismissal bell rang. It rang like a bell hears its own echo and turns to find where it is coming from. It rang a minute early, a minute late. It rang 3 times, then all at once, then not at all, and the students rose and looked to see which they were meant to obey, and chose one by each person's old instinct, moving in streams that slid through each other without collision. In the thrashing, it was just us and the hum of the overhead lights and one coughing child and the computer that had decided now was the time to restart and apply updates. The hallway filled with feet. Somewhere, a boy took a fall on the bleachers. The sound was a wooden drum beat, 10 yards and 30 years away. Laughter broke and knit. The intercom clicked and breathed. "Which one of us is supposed to stay?" he asked. "It says arrival at 2:20. He glanced at the legal pad, and I realized he could see the list even if it wasn't inked for him. "It says, we are." "We are?" I said. I realized the intercom carried my words out into the hall, repeated them a beat later to rooms that had already heard them. "We are, we are, we are." Frank appeared in the doorway, like an answer whose shape is right, even if it isn't satisfying. He leaned on the frame with a weariness that felt like the building leaning back. "Don't make it ugly," he said. "It doesn't have to be ugly." "We're not fighters," the other me said, and something in the way he said it made me think he had said it before in other rooms like this one. "You only got one badge," Frank said. He was as neutral as a level. I looked at my chest. The badge was there. Theirs was too. Both said 14. We did the kind of thing people do when the end of a game comes close. We tried to build rules that would make it less ugly. We compared scars, a small half moon on the wrist from a fence, a thin pale line on the knee from a bicycle at 8. We compared tastes. Tea, no sugar. Coffee only when necessary. Black, a dislike for custard. We compared small, stupid things, the way we fold napkins, whether we take our shoes off when we enter, whether we ever knock on wood. These were identical, or near enough that to argue would have been like arguing about which of 2 raindrops is wetter. "What about your middle name?" he asked. "Abel," I said. He nodded. We each said the name of the first person we kissed. We each said the name of the street we grew up on. Our throats felt raw by the third. We each recited our social. We each spelled our grandmother's last name with the vowel that always trips you if you are lying. The answers aligned with a click that felt like bones. Outside, the air darkened, though a clock said 2:17. "I met a girl today," he said. "She asked to go to the nurse." "She didn't go," I said. We both looked at the door. In the end, we did not choose by debate or logic. We did not argue rights or duels or coin tosses. Frank shifted his weight, and the building shifted with him. The hallway outside our door was emptier, though noises continued. A locker door slammed somewhere, but the slam came soft, like a hand clapping in a glove. The room had the feeling of late afternoon in winter when you can't tell if you're hungry or just tired. He reached into the envelope and pulled out the attendance sheet. He held it so that I could see it. My name was printed at the top, his handwriting across the bottom. He had a neat hand, the careful loops, the old photograph cursive. Theodore Abel Carver, present. "Who wrote mine this morning?" I asked. He lifted a shoulder. "Someone who remembers us." He took a pen from his pocket. He held it point down a moment before writing, as people do when they have already committed but want a second to honor that commitment. "If I sign here," he said, touching the page where the teacher signs after last bell, "does that?" "It does whatever it did last time," Frank said. And it's possible I imagined the sadness under the words, the way sad is just a temperature. "Do you remember last time?" I asked him, but I wasn't sure which him I asked. He signed. The looping signature looked like mine when I take a breath before my name. He set the pen down. "Okay," he said, and I heard in his tone the first crack in the polite surface as reality began to insist. "Okay." "Okay," I said back, as if keeping the infinite possible outcomes in narrow lanes. He reached up and unpinned his badge. He laid it on the desk next to the attendance sheet. I reached up. I unpinned mine. We exchanged them, hands briefly overlapping above the form. His skin was warm, mine was cool, or the opposite. It's hard to say. The room flickered. Not just the lights, but the definition of the objects softened and sharpened, like the building had chosen a different focus setting. "Tomorrow," he said, "will you?" I shook my head once, a small denial to the idea of any promise. "We'll see," I said, simple as a weather report. He stepped back. The air between us felt like a tight rope someone might walk. He did not turn toward the door yet. Felt the urge to say something like a benediction, and had none. The intercom clicked, and the whispery feedback rose and settled. Outside in the courtyard, the iron bench was whole. A person flickered in the opposite wing window, and then not. The tree held both leaves and no leaves, depending on whether you allowed yourself to use the corners of your eyes. The building exhaled. The lights hummed and chose a tone and stuck with it. The clock's second hand committed. He picked up the manila envelope, now lighter by the weight of the attendance sheet. He tucked it under his arm the way I'd tucked mine, as if careful not to crease it. He looked at me. We looked at each other. It is an odd thing to see your own eyes given back to you. "Good luck, Mr. Carver," he said. He said it exactly the way Diane had said it that morning. He said it as if it always ends like this. "You too," I said. He stepped out into the hallway. He walked away down the corridor, stepping over the loose tread as if it were a puddle. His back was my back. He paused at the stairwell and looked once into the small wired glass, and I could tell by the set of his shoulder he saw himself. He went down. I stood alone. I could hear the building forgetting the day in real time, laughter falling further away, the boiler beginning to think about evening, a song of air in the vents. I turned the smartboard off and watched its square go dark. I turned the whiteboard over with the dry cloth the way Henderson might. The cloth came away gray. The neatly written words beneath mine did not smudge. Only connect. Only connect. Only connect. When I bent to retrieve my thermos from under the desk, Another note slid from the crease in the legal pad. It made a sound like a small thing deciding to speak. I picked it up. "You're not supposed to be here," it began, in those blocky letters. "The real you gets here tomorrow." I held it. The paper felt like the attendance sheets. Heavy, wedding invitation heavy. In the margin, in ink finer than the block, someone had written in that careful cursive, "Stay late if you want to stay." I looked at the clock. 2:20, steady. The intercom clicked and my voice came over it, somewhere out there, saying something I wasn't saying anymore. The voice had the calm of routine. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew the cadence. "Please have your students." The way of asking people to make choices at the right time. Diane's head appeared at the door. "Mr. Carver," she said, are you staying to help with tutoring?" "He usually does." "Henderson, his kids come at 3. I stared at her. "Am I supposed to?" I asked. She smiled as if delighted by a private joke. "If you're still you," she said lightly and lifted a hand to wave and turned away. I pinned the badge at my chest the way one decides a path by placing a foot. It read 14. It read my name. It read anyone's, if you tilted it. On my way down the stairs, the step gave under my foot and then did not, like a memory, picked up and set back. In the lobby, the framed mission statement had fallen slightly crooked. The reflection in the glass showed a man who looked like me, then looked like someone a little older, then looked like a substitute teacher in a different year. The parking lot was a flat gray field under a sky that had chosen late. When I reached my car, the sycamore above had lost its leaves in the space between moments and then recovered them, small and bright. My phone buzzed. A text from unknown, "See you tomorrow." The second text, "Arriving." I got in and put both hands on the wheel. I watched the minute click from 2:21 to 2:20 and then back, then on. The school sat in the rear view like a place I had been born and forgotten. In the second-floor window of the east wing, a man stood with his hand on the glass. He didn't wave. He pressed his palm flat, as if the gesture could be a hinge. If there is a loop, someone must be the top of it. If there are two of you, one must be the guest and one the host, unless the house belongs to the house. The note in my pocket said I was not supposed to be here. The badge on my chest made a case for my presence. I turned the key. It didn't catch, not the first time. On the second, the car thought about it, then held. I drove the short length of the lot with the feeling of leaving a party at which I had been the wrong kind of familiar. As I turned onto the road, the marquee letters flickered and then steadied. "Welcome back," it said, missing the letters you would expect. "Welcome me BCK," which is welcome enough when the building gets tired. At home, I put the note on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. Later, I slept. I woke at 5 a.m., then 5:30 a.m., then 6 a.m. In the shower, I touched my temple and found no ink. In the mirror, I looked like a tried-on version of myself. At 6:59, I sat in the car under the sycamore. The air smelled like mint and something warmer, older. The building looked exactly as it had and slightly older. I waited for the dashboard to click to 7 o'clock and then stepped out, and across the lot, a man stepped out of a car that might have been the same color as mine if you didn't look too close. He walked the same way and hesitated at the door the same beat. He wore a tie with stripes. He held a manila envelope. He looked up at the second-floor windows as if calculating whether he could see himself. "You're early," Frank said at the door, smiling like he knew this was the point where maybe something could change, and also knew it wouldn't. "You beat yourself this time." "Do I sign in?" I asked. Diane already held out the laminated badge. It said 14. She nodded, the same practiced and genuine motion. "Have a good day, Mr. Carver," she said, then softer, "Again." Her eyes did a quick check of my face, like verifying a picture against an ID. They found what they needed and what they didn't. Upstairs, the third step held. The east wing lights hummed. In room 205, Something like the smell of chalk pre-existed my entry. On Henderson's desk, the legal pad lay with its top sheet torn off. The attendance sheet had the date. The check marks were faint and nearly there. At the bottom, in that careful hand, my full name weighted present tense. The door to the storage room at the end of the hall wore a snowflake that had softened with humidity. The copier slept with its mouth closed. The courtyard tree had made small choices about leaves that I could not follow. The first bell cried like a memory. Students came, and they were children, and they were older, and they were mirrors, and they were themselves. One girl entered and moved to the window and put her hand to the glass, a ritual I still didn't know. "Can I go to the nurse?" she asked once the bell had trapped us all. "If you need to," I said. She nodded as if this were our secret. We began. We read, we drew, eyes closed. I told them to trust the line. They did, their hands moving in air like blind swimmers. They laughed once, small, when someone's line that had been a house became a bird. The boy in the camo hoodie watched me with that not unkind, not simply curious diagnostic gaze. The girl with the gold Jesus would not meet my eyes, and in the not meeting told me everything I needed to know about how she met them when I wasn't looking. Between bells, when the hallway breathed out an empty space, I stood at the window and looked across the courtyard into the opposite wing, where a man stood watching with his hand on the glass. He didn't wave, he watched. The light lay on his face like a sheet. The iron bench had 2 legs, then 4, then shadow. I had an idea. It was the only one in the room, small as a coin, and it was this. If I wrote the note differently, would it matter? If I wrote no note, which of us would arrive? The legal pad took ink beautifully. I leaned over it and wrote without looking at my hand. "You belonged here yesterday. Come when you come." I folded it, carefully making a small triangle at the corner to fray. I did not know which desk would receive it. I could only leave it in the drawer where notes are born. By the final period, the building's breath had slowed until I could feel each inhalation like a wave, lifting the whole structure and settling it. The intercom hummed. My voice whispered a thing I had not yet said, then said it. The drawer of Henderson's desk clicked open on its own, a misaligned thing finding its true slide. The hallway had emptied and filled twice, without the bell admitting it had happened. The light was a color it had not been before and would be again. At 2:17 there was a knock that sounded like a polite hand on a familiar door. The knob turned, the door opened. "Good afternoon," said a voice like mine, with a rhythm I recognized. "I'm Mr. Carver." We were both wearing solid ties today. His mouth had a tenderness at the edges that mine had lost. He held a manila envelope. He had already met Frank today. He had parked under the sycamore. We stood like bookends. The student sat between us like a shelf of things a person tries to balance. "Didn't you already do this last week?" the boy in the back said, but he smiled toward us both, as if giving a line in a play he liked. This time, when we exchanged badges, my hands weren't quite steady. He told me the street he grew up on, and I said it with him. We said the names. We made a small talk of sameness. My throat ached with repetition. He signed the attendance sheet with a flourish I recognized as the way I used to sign when I thought signatures mattered. He took the badge that might have been mine already. When he left, he paused at the looking window in the stairwell. The wired glass reflected a man. The glass had lines that made the man seem briefly stitched. Frank leaned into the door. "It's not always like this," he said. "It's usually like this." "Which one of us stays?" I asked, and it was not a plea, but the question you ask at a crossroad when both paths are maps. "Which one of you can stand to leave?" he said, and the mildness was an old friend. I considered. The badge sat heavy on my chest. The legal pad's indentations read like scripture if you looked at them with your head tilted. The attendance sheet lay with my name written in careful cursive. The students began to rise because the room told them it was time. I could stay. I could stay and do tutoring at 3. I could learn the locker combinations that no one says aloud and how to open the cafeteria milk cartons without tearing the wrong corner. I could learn which students prefer to sit near the vent and which use the window to measure themselves against the day. I could decide that the building's moods were simply weather and that you bring an umbrella and go anyway. I could leave. I could leave and return tomorrow to see which me arrived then, whether the note had changed anything, whether the bench had 4 legs or not, whether Diane said again. I watched the man in the opposite wing lift his hand to the glass. I lifted mine. I felt the cool of the pain. It did not matter if I touched it or did not. The gesture was its own hinge. The bell rang. It rang wrong and right. The building sighed. On the attendance sheet, next to the line for a substitute signature, 2 names had been written, one clean and looped, one a little hurried, a little splayed, both of them mine. I turned the paper over as if that would change which side the signatures could be found on. On the back, in faint, blocky print, impressed by pressure but not inked, the words pressed through. You're not supposed to be here. The real you gets here tomorrow. That night at home, I put the badge on the kitchen table next to the note. The badge's plastic reflected the ceiling light, then my hand, then a man with the same hand who had moved to turn off the lamp in his house where he lived, which might have been mine. I lay down. The room took my shape and then gave it back. I slept. I woke with the feeling you have when a dream has presented you with a choice and you have made it without moving. In the morning, the sycamore would be there. The marquee would be missing letters and still say enough. Diane would karate chop a stack of passes and say my name with the confidence of someone who has said it many times. The list would lay in the drawer. The storage room would open or not. The copier would remember me until it forgot, and then remember again. In the hallway somewhere, my voice would be saying, "We are." It would be saying it in polite tones, calm, practiced, useful. And the second voice would follow it by a beat, and together they would be as true as anything is true in a building that keeps company with itself. If you ask me which of us survived, which one of us continued, which one of us kept the badge, and which one kept the manila envelope, I'll tell you I signed. I'll tell you I left or stayed. Both answers feel right when I say them and wrong when I hold them too long. And when I walk by the window in the east wing, there is a man there with his hand on the glass, and sometimes he is me, and sometimes he is the man who is me, and sometimes he is neither. He never waves. He watches, which is a kind of staying. His breath fogs the glass a little, then clears. The glass keeps his print for a second longer and then lets it go. Thanks for listening. I really enjoyed putting this story together for you. If you liked it, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories, and share it with someone who's into this kind of stuff. See you next time.